Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified, where we break down, legal principles for students and enthusiasts. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a topic that's super important for anyone interested in international law, especially from an Indian perspective. The concept of jus ad bellum and jus in bello.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, they're like the rules of war. When is it okay to go to war, and how do you behave once you're actually in a war?
You know, it's fascinating. These concepts aren't exactly new. They've been around for centuries. You can find them in ancient texts like the Mahabharata and even ancient Egyptian writings.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it shows that humans have always thought about, the ethics of warfare.
That's a great point. It's not just about the fighting itself. It's about morality, how we decide what's right and wrong, even when things are really, really bad. So let's start with jus ad bellum, the right to go to war. Like, let's say India's facing a serious threat. How do we figure out if military action is the right call?
That's where jus ad bellum comes in. It's like a checklist, a moral checklist to see if going to war is actually justified.
So it's like a really high standard.
Exactly. That's super important for keeping peace in the world. The first thing on that checklist is competent authority. Only legitimate authorities can declare war, like a recognized government. This prevents just any random group from deciding to go to war whenever they want.
Right. That would be chaos if anyone could declare war just because. So it's not just who declares war, but why they're doing it. That leads us to just cause, right?
You got it. There needs to be a really good moral reason for going to war, like self-defense. Say if a neighboring country kept violating India's borders, that could be a just cause for going to war.
But not just some silly disagreement or wanting their resources.
No, 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 not at all.
Okay, so even if a country has a good reason like self-defense, their intentions still matter, right? That's where right intention comes in.
Absolutely. The ultimate goal should always be a just and lasting peace, not revenge or trying to take over someone else's land.
Right. They can't just say, oh, we're defending ourselves and then use it as an excuse to grab more territory or punish another country.
Exactly. It's got to be about setting things right and achieving peace.
And to make sure things don't escalate too quickly, we have the last resort criterion.
That's a big one. You have to try everything else first. Diplomacy, sanctions, negotiations, all of that needs to be on the table before even thinking about war.
So war is the very last option.
The absolute last resort. It's
Yeah.
kind of like you wouldn't go straight to surgery for a sprained ankle, would you?
Definitely not. So this next word is interesting, probability of success. That sounds more like a military strategy thing than an ethical one.
It's actually both. It's about being realistic and responsible. If you know you have almost no chance of winning a war, is it really ethical to send your soldiers into a situation where they'll probably lose? Like, some people say that the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan didn't have a clear exit strategy. That kind of ties into this whole probability of success thing.
I see what you mean. So it's not just about having a good reason to fight. It's also about making sure you can actually achieve something positive.
Right.
So Jus ad bellum really lays down the law on when it's okay to start a war. But what about during the war? Is anything allowed then?
Definitely not. That's where just and bello comes in. It says that even in a justified war, there are still limits. You can't just throw all morality out the window.
So even in all the chaos, there are still rules. Okay, so let's dive into jus in bello, the right conduct during war. First up, we've got distinction.
Distinction is all about being able to tell the difference between people who are fighting and people who aren't. Civilians shouldn't be targets.
So like you wouldn't bomb a hospital just to get one enemy soldier.
Exactly. That would be a clear violation of distinction.
Got it. So minimizing civilian casualties is a top priority.
Absolutely. And it's not just about who you're targeting, but also how much force you use. That's where proportionality comes in. It's kind of like if someone shoves you, you don't pull out a gun, right? You only use as much force as you need to protect yourself. It's the same idea in war. The force you use has to be in proportion to what you're trying to achieve.
So even if you're fighting a war, you still have to try to avoid unnecessary damage and suffering.
Exactly. And that leads us to the next principle, military necessity.
Okay, so what does that mean during a war?
It means every action you take in a war should have a clear military purpose. You can't just cause harm for no reason. You always have to weigh the potential harm against the potential gain.
So it's not about revenge or just showing off how powerful you are. It's about being strategic and focused on specific goals.
Right.
Now, how about prisoners of war? What does jus in bello say about how they should be treated?
That's a really important part of jus in bello. There's a principle called fair treatment of prisoners of war. It says that captured soldiers or soldiers who surrender have to be treated humanely no matter what, no torture. and they have to be given basic necessities like food, water, and medical care.
So even your enemies deserve to be treated with a basic level of respect.
Exactly. It's about remembering that everyone's human, even in the middle of a war. And there's one more principle we need to talk about, maybe the most important one. No means malum in seal.
You mentioned that earlier, right? No means evil in themselves. What kinds of things does that rule out on the battlefield?
It means there are certain things you just never do, no matter what the circumstances are. Things like using chemical weapons or torturing prisoners. Those are always wrong.
It's like drawing a line in the sand and saying, we will not go there.
Exactly.
But putting these principles into practice in real-life wars must be super challenging.
It is, especially with the way warfare is changing these days, with things like terrorism and guerrilla warfare where the lines are blurred. It's harder than ever to apply these ancient principles.
Like, how do you even define who's a combatant when you're dealing with groups that aren't traditional armies?
Right. That's one of the big dilemmas we face today. We have to constantly reevaluate how to apply these principles in new situations.
So Jus ad Bellum tells us when it's okay to go to war. And Jus in Bello tells us how to behave during the war. But what about after the war is over?
There's a set of principles for that, too. It's called jus post bellum.
Jus post bellum, what's that all about?
You can think of it as justice after war. It deals with stuff like peace treaties and war crime trials and rebuilding.
So it's about making sure the peace is actually just and lasting.
Exactly.
What are some of the key things that Jus post bellum focuses on?
It's about getting to the root of the problem, so the war doesn't just happen again. Things like making sure peace treaties are fair and actually last, and holding people accountable for war crimes, and of course helping countries rebuild after all the destruction.
So it's not just about stopping the fighting, it's about building a lasting peace.
Exactly. Jus post bellum recognizes that true peace means more than just putting down your weapons. It means dealing with the underlying issues that caused the conflict in the first place.
It's like you can win the battle but still lose the war if you don't handle the peace properly.
How does jus post bellum apply to a country like India, with its unique role in the world?
That's a really good question, and it's a big reason why these principles are so relevant for anyone studying law in India. Jus post bellum could really shape how India approaches conflict resolution in the future. In what ways?
Well, think about India's involvement in peacekeeping missions, for example, or its position on international courts for war crimes, or even how India provides aid to countries that are recovering from war.
So it's all about rebuilding trust and finding a way to move forward after a conflict.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even former enemies have to find a way to live together peacefully and build a shared future. That might mean setting up truth and reconciliation commissions or providing reparations to victims, or even helping to rebuild infrastructure and institutions in countries that have been devastated by war.
Wow, we've covered so much today, from the origins of just war theory to how it applies to the world we live in now. It's amazing how these principles are still so relevant after all these centuries.
It shows how humans have always struggled with this balance, between the need to defend yourself and the need to avoid causing unnecessary harm, and to make sure justice is served.
Before we go, let's do a quick recap of the differences between Jus ad Bellum, Jus in Bello, and Jus post Bellum. Jus ad Bellum is all about when it's okay to go to war. Like, is there a just cause? Was it a last resort? And so on.
Right.
Jus in Bello is about how the war is actually fought, making sure civilians aren't targeted, treating prisoners fairly, not using weapons that are just inherently evil.
Yeah, and Jus post Bellum focuses on what happens after the war.
Right. Creating a lasting peace by making sure peace treaties are fair, holding people accountable for war crimes, rebuilding what was destroyed.
All three of these principles work together to make war and peace a little bit more ethical and just.
This has been such an interesting deep dive into just war theory. I hope everyone listening, especially those interested in Indian law, got a lot out of it. Any final thoughts for our listeners today?
I would just say, think about how these principles could shape India's foreign policy in the future. As India becomes a bigger and bigger player on the world stage, how can it help create a more peaceful and just world? That's something worth thinking about.
Absolutely. It's a complicated issue with no easy answers, but understanding these principles is a great place to start. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to LexTalks for more deep dives into the world of law.